It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jana Roberts. Before I do that, a little bit of housekeeping. We're doing this session and this seminar as part of the Surveying Qualitative Methods Core and our role in the UMB HCC partnership as the Research Design and Analysis Core. As some of you might know, we hold a number of these seminars often during the academic year. They highlight different topics, oftentimes focused in on methods and other tools that kind of help different research projects and researchers who are part of the partnership. I'm Anna. I'm a lead scientist with the Surveying Qualitative Methods Core. For those of you who are new to this setting, we do have a lot of previously recorded seminars that are on the website. So we encourage folks to look into those, reach out to us with any questions or suggestions for future seminars. I'll monitor the chat during the course of this. And then Jane, maybe if there's points that you want to stop and ask questions to the attendees, that's fine with us too. Just a quick intro in terms of Dr. Roberts. And so her background is in medical anthropology and sociocultural psychology with a master's from the University College of London and a PhD from the London School of Economics. Her work really spans a range of projects and focuses on social and cultural and ethical dimensions of diagnosis, treatment, and accessibility of healthcare, patient quality and safety, and issues concerning mental health, especially with children and young people. In addition to her role with us at the Survey Corps, she's an instructor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School, as well as a qualitative methods faculty for the American Society of Hematology Medical Education. Today, she's really going to step in and present on AI in qualitative research, bringing up some key considerations in this really rapidly evolving landscape. Without further ado, I'll present Dr. Roberts, my friend and colleague. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Let's see. And can you see the slides okay?
Yep, they look great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And it's nice to see some familiar names and faces here. So I think what wasn't in my bio is that I am by no means like the ultimate expert on the use of AI and qualitative research. Really, and it's funny, I was talking to a friend the other day about how I was giving this talk, and they were saying, oh, it's interesting that you're giving a talk about AI when you still have like the iPhone 12. And I have no idea which iteration of the iPhone we're on now. But the point being that I am not like by any means an early adopter of technology or necessarily entirely always comfortable with it. But as a qualitative researcher and as an instructor of qualitative methods, I think given the increasing ubiquity of AI as a tool that's being used across research, but in qualitative research, particularly here, I think me and Anna and Brett, the other qualitative, my colleagues here in the core, that's something that we're starting to think about regularly on a daily basis and something that we kind of need to better understand and think about these kind of ways of how we might leverage AI responsibly. So we're presenting this talk in the spirit of sort of thinking it through, using it as a tool that doesn't necessarily replace the critical thinking or the reflexivity, which is so central to our work as qualitative researchers, but thinking sort of more broadly about some of these key considerations in a rapidly evolving landscape. So this isn't necessarily a how-to, but I think there are monthly office hours oriented towards that we can talk about at the end. But this will be again more sort of broad discussion around some of these key considerations. So I think where to begin, first of all, I think, AI in qualitative analysis, and particularly with regards to some of the software that a lot of us are familiar with, it's not a new concept. Early machine learning features like automatic coding or sentiment analysis have been present in some of these computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software packages for years, right? But it is still evolving, and researchers are sort of in a constant state now of experimenting with or learning from how to work with AI. So we're really kind of all in this together as we sort of figure out what's what, especially since it's changing so quickly, right? And that's I think what's new is that generative AI kind of promises to do some of these tasks as well or better than humans, right? So the recent integration, for example, of large language models to power some of these AI tools can kind of help move us towards that. But I think the caveat being, at least for today, this may be different a week from now, but just because AI can do something really quickly, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do it accurately or well in line with your aims. So that's kind of going to be the crux of what we're focusing on today. But in terms of some ways that how generative AI can be helpful in qualitative research, well, it can be really helpful in a generative capacity, right? So using AI to kind of generate ideas for aspects of the qualitative workflow or theories. Um, but to that point, you still need to understand it well enough to see if it's really applicable, in order for it to be able to simplify for you. Helpful with sort of determining best data collection methods, maybe for training purposes, having AI generate sort of synthetic data for research, for practicing coding, for training for mock interviews. It can be helpful in terms of converting and summarizing, which is how a lot of folks, I think that's the sort of gateway into using generative AI and qualitative research and analysis is through maybe live translation or audio transcription, for which, current AI tools can generate products that really do rival skilled humans, right? They can summarize whole documents at different levels, whether that's selected text segments, the whole corpus, already coded segments. Um, but I mean, as Anna and Brett and I were talking about this yesterday, Anna, as you mentioned yesterday, like even with that transcription support, while AI has improved, it's not fully accurate, especially with like multiple speakers or if people have accents, which is something that we'll get into in a little bit. So it is like this sort of risk benefit calculation of like, okay, well, it might be faster, but when it does sort of remove the researcher from the data, we can't really be sure how accurate it is. And then some might argue by the time you've reviewed it, you might as well have just gone through the transcript yourself. But I'm trying to focus on how it's helpful. So, I think it can be helpful in terms of generating those summaries. It can be helpful in a conversant sense, right? Including like the function to explain terms. If there's a technical term or a theory in the literature you're unsure about, you can, have it give you an explanation. Or if a participant in a transcript uses a colloquialism that you're not familiar with. But again, you always want to sort of double check that it's not providing some sort of hallucinated output. And then finally, and this might not be an exhaustive list, but labeling and sorting, right? So with regards to coding, helping to suggest perhaps a structure or categories for coding, finding data to fit codes, proposing some of those initial themes for further analysis to start to organize the data into more manageable sections. And I think with regards to labeling and sorting, there are different levels with which you can approach the use of AI from, the fully automated AI coding, which, as we'll talk about in a second, can be a little bit riskier. Coding based on human specified sort of intentions. So kind of feeding your analytic questions, your project context, and that kind of thing into the prompt, or sort of more directed AI coding, which is based on, a defined code, and then the AI then goes looking for text that fits, which I think in some cases it does surprisingly well, though I personally don't have direct experience with that. I know there's some published papers that have done some empirical work around that. But so these tools, can be really helpful, but again, still require sort of careful handling and human oversight. So I think one of the first questions to ask if you're kind of going in thinking that you are going to use generative AI as a tool or a research assistant is, does its use kind of fit your qualitative approach? And I think on this call there are probably different levels of engagement with qualitative research, but for example, starting with the research question, the overarching paradigm, the analytic tradition, not with the tool itself. So, for example, if there are folks on the call that are familiar with like a grounded theory approach, where the transformation of the interpretation of the data is oriented towards the researcher's ability to kind of conceptualize a core category out of the data to generate an original theory. And the AI in that sense isn't going to be able to necessarily generate, at least at this point, to my knowledge, an original theory. It can only sort of summarize or recognize existing text because it really is oriented towards patterns, not nuance, and not necessarily thematic patterns, but sort of more language oriented patterns. Um, so they're sort of inherently built on these pre-existing patterns, forcing data maybe into more predetermined boxes when your approach may call for something more generative and interpretive and grounded in the data and nuance and perspective. So in approaches where this kind of meaning is co-constructed or situated or more interpretive, um, AI outputs should be treated more as like provisional aids as opposed to an organizational tools as opposed to findings because your role as the researcher is so central there. And then to a point about sort of like reviewers and publishing, there may be some skepticism if AI use, if it's kind of if it's presented as a qualitative project and then the AI use appears to sort of distance the researcher from the data or undermine reflexivity, which is so central to qualitative approaches, right? That role as a researcher, as a co-constructor of knowledge. Um, so thinking a bit about some of the ways that it can be sort of most helpful versus higher risk uses. Um, I think a rule of thumb, as we were just sort of describing, is that if the step involves sort of interpretation of meaning, then that's really sort of a signal that, you know, your role as a researcher, your role as a human should be primary, right? That AI can be a really effective assistant or tool, but it may lack some of the contextual understanding of the data. So it can't necessarily make judgments about the relevance or significance or novelty of insights, right? And these kind of descriptive summaries of content, you know, that's not all that is entailed in a qualitative analysis. So especially more interpretivist analysis that's aiming to kind of generate theory, as we were just saying, or answer questions about the why and the how and the what. And there was I went to a webinar that was all about critical thinking and reflexivity and qualitative data analysis. Christina Silver from University of Surrey, and she was talking about how, you know, the degree to which, as qualitative researchers, your own knowledge of the data really is needed to move to the next stage of the analytic process, and sort of what can be lost is that accumulated latent understanding of meaning, right? So the first step in like Brown and Clark's thematic analysis is familiarization with the data. Um, and that's considered a step in analysis because, you know, it really is that understanding of meaning and that accumulation of understanding of participant experiences um, that kind of contributes to the developing knowledge and expertise of these findings and the knowledge and expertise that you as a researcher can bring. Um, so some of the more sort of like defensible uses, I guess, of AI and qualitative research. Well, again, as we talked about, some sort of like transcription support or help with de-identifying data, retrieval and search or preliminary summaries, maybe codebook consistency checks, right? Like large language models can potentially review coded segments for sort of adherence to code definitions or maybe suggest areas where you might merge or split a code or develop a new code where patterns are inconsistent. Um, but to that end, I think there's also a flip side, and that is those are kind of areas where it does feel more along the lines or oriented towards organization or summarizing in a way where there's not that next level kind of thematization that would be important for your own research. And sort of to that end, where there might be a little bit more risk, um, quote unquote, might be if you were just to kind of feed a data set in and have the AI code it automatically, or just leave it up to the AI to generate themes, leave it up to the AI to write up your findings. Like when I've done some little experiments around this, it always freaks me out a little bit. And it's like, would you like me to generate a report as found in a findings section from like, well, yes, but no, So I mean, because you really do need to worry about sort of fabricated quotes, which I think Brett, you made the point yesterday that it's sort of like, okay, well, fabricated quotes maybe less like about high risk use and more about the fallibility of the model, which I think that's a really good point, but that is something that needs to be considered, and something that we're hearing more and more about are quotes that just are either so kind of taken out of context or so paraphrased in a way that the original intent is lost or just invented, right? So fabricated quotes, and then sort of using sort of preliminary summaries that are meant more as sort of like maybe guides as like the end all be all for your findings rather than returning to the transcripts to kind of do a little comparison to see if it's accurate. Maybe it was stated in a way that makes sense and is very kind of coherent with what's in the data and can be a really useful tool, but then you want to really make sure that it's capturing what's in the data and with regards to your analytic approach as well, and not just kind of taken as rote and taken completely independently out of context. So we could go down a rabbit hole of all the different ways we've played around with where AI has gotten it wrong, but I thought, Brett, don't mean to put you on the spot, but like because Brett's done some playing around with this, and I thought it was really interesting. He was sharing some of the ways that like it had just completely hallucinated a summary based on no data. So Brett, I don't know if you want to like,
Yeah, so we wanted to see, we had a survey with an open-ended question, and we had over 5,000 respondents to the survey. So we wanted to say, can AI help us just summarize or at least find trends within these results? And so I wrote out the prompt. I described what the question was, and I accidentally hit enter before putting in any of the data. And what was shocking to me is that it generated a response summarizing the data that identified six dominant themes within the data. And then also, it had this sort of conclusionary sentence. So it said, overall, the responses reflect as a desire for more inclusive and comprehensive approaches to women's health that address both physical and mental health needs, with a particular emphasis on reproductive health and chronic disease management. Now, if you were just reading that, right, prima facie, that seems like a really reasonable and predictable response. But again, I had not entered any data. And so you can really run into some significant problems that if you're not, as Jane said, really steeped in the transcripts itself, steeped in the data, you could be very easily fooled.
yeah. And that's something that there's a term, I think I have it in one of the later slides, but and I have it in the reference too. There's a paper by Cook and colleagues, and he refers to what's called like truthy nonsense, which I was like, yes, truthy nonsense. Like it sounds really plausible and it uses all the right terms and it sounds really smart and it sounds like it's referring to something, but yet not. So I think and that is something that I think even as these models are getting more and more sophisticated, it just seems like that is still very much an issue. So yeah, thanks, Brett, because that I just feel like that, yeah, that was kind of shocking. So AI getting it wrong, hallucinations, that is one serious methodological risk. I think something that you can't kind of think about the use of AI in qualitative research and some of the implications and considerations without also thinking about bias as a major methodological risk, which I know a lot of folks on this call think about and actively work on, and some of the kind of ethical considerations around this, right? But AI systems can really reproduce and amplify biases from training data, prompts, labeling conventions, historical inequities, and just the same way as we worry about bias with sort of human researchers, we also need to think about it with regards to AI, um, and thinking about ways that, we don't want to kind of reinforce assumptions embedded in questions asked of it, or thinking through like, well, what are the dominant discourses in the training data that, for example, like my own experiment that I did, feeding an interview with a female psychiatrist and asking for sort of like generate some themes, generate some summaries, and it just automatically assumed it was a he because oh, it must be because psychiatrists, right? So it's like, well, that's that where did that come from? It was trained on something. So reinforcing those kinds of assumptions, and I think also thinking through again as we do with research more generally, but just kind of reinforcing here that these risks are going to be greater for marginalized groups or around more culturally specific meanings or dialects or multilingual data, right? Like I think most of what's on the internet and most of what these tools are trained on is in English. So what does that, how does that, what are the implications of that? Um, and sycophancy bias, which is something that we, I think and talk a lot about where it's trained to tell you what you want to hear, so may produce an answer even if there's not really any relevant data, or to Brett's point, no data. It's like, oh well, he wants a summary. I don't have anything to work with, but I'm going to give him a summary. So these are just some of the things to think about, and I think sort of a central takeaway there. And I know this is all very broad brush. It's like we're trying to kind of cover a lot of the bases. We could kind of have a whole talk on this, but like this idea of maybe not assuming that consistency equals validity and building in some sort of like quality checks as you would um, with sort of research more generally, right? So whether that's like subgroup checks, maybe like breaking down if you do have interviews or focus group data, breaking it into more sort of meaningful categories to look for patterns or themes there that may differ across groups. Because, this might be useful in an overall analysis. You may find that, your analysis reveals broad themes, but, your data best, right? And so you suspect that maybe certain subpopulations or subgroups within that data set have different experiences or perspectives. So just making sure that you're going in and capturing what's there. And this is another reason why kind of knowing the data is so central, right? Um, and also, I think, being aware of there's a lot of overgeneralizing or overclaiming. So from a single sentence in an interview, maybe an AI summary might make claims that, this is the way things are everywhere all the time, or where a clinician says in an interview, we hope that doing X achieves Y for this particular community. AI output might claim like X does achieve Y, right? And kind of makes this broad claim. And this may be across, 20 interviews and this one person says it. And then this is a claim that's being made as like um, a central kind of finding of the study. So, and I think, Anna made the point yesterday around with regards to bias, because we were sort of talking about, well, how to kind of talk through this in this talk, that maybe it is more about just sort of like recognizing that it exists and understanding how it influences any given step of the process as it would for human work. And I think again, I think to some of the experimenting that Brett was doing, just the hours that were spent kind of determining the best prompts or follow-up prompts to get the system to really do what he wanted it to do. Just to kind of like make sure that, you're kind of addressing some of these concerns and trying to minimize bias where you can. Um, so in addition to sort of some of these, like the hallucination and the bias, I think some of these the sort of safety guardrails, right, around sort of confidentiality, consent, data governance, right? So never assume that a public AI tool is safe for interview or field note data. I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that like the ChatGPT for DFCI sandbox, I believe is like HIPAA compliant and has all of these sort of guardrails in place. I don't know the degree. I'm sure there are some other tools out there. I don't know the extent of the availability of the tools that may also be sort of safer in this regard, but never assume, right? And even de-identified qualitative text may remain re-identifiable when combined with other information, right? So I think you need to be really kind of clear and careful that any AI sort of meets data security requirements specific to your study. So thinking in terms of like ethics and IRB or grant applications, they should specify, um, the specific tool or vendor. Where is the data going? How is it being retained or deleted? If you are using like an online AI transcription service, what is the retrieval and the removal of that and when, that kind of thing, because you're often uploading the audio in addition to the transcript that is generated. Um, and another point is participant consent, so are participants consenting to AI assisted processing? Um, I think that's a big question, if you're uploading particularly to public sites, maybe less of a concern for something like a ChatGPT for DFCI, but uploading interview data that a participant didn't consent to. And I personally don't have any direct experience with this, but it is something that I think about because I'm not at the stage where we're kind of like feeding the AI in to kind of do an analysis, or working outside of the ChatGPT sandbox for like methodological or experimental purposes. But I think that would be something to consider, right? And to build into informed consent. And it probably will become more and more ubiquitous as the use of AI as a tool is becoming more ubiquitous. But so I think, again, just this kind of coming back to this idea of the hallucination and loss of context as being pretty salient, right? As we were kind of talking about, and I probably should have had this slide before, but coming back to it because it's an important point, these plausible but false summaries, invented details, or fabricated citations is a big one, right? So this idea of the truthy nonsense I mentioned. There's also this idea of the missing middle that was proposed by Jousey and colleagues in a paper in 2025. This idea that like oftentimes the generative AI tool is heavily reliant on, say, the beginning of a transcript and the end of a transcript for its findings, but everything in between maybe gets a little lost in the shuffle. So it can also flatten ambiguity, contradiction, chronology, any kind of like interactional context, often the things that are the most substantive aspect of qualitative analysis, kind of understanding those interrelational or contextual dynamics that go more than just the words being said and the patterns being seen that kind of speak to sort of the broader phenomenon that you may be trying to understand. So again, any AI produced summary, code, or interpretation really should be checked against the original transcript and audio, and then kind of some sort of analytic memos. So that kind of leads into kind of how you might preserve rigor when using AI, which again is very similar to how. Oh, I see there's a question in the chat. Oh, thank you, Clark. Sorry. I was like, oh, I can see the chat. So yeah, very much an overlap with the how we might preserve rigor in, when not using AI, right? So the idea of maintaining an audit trail. But in this case, as you might with a systematic literature review, like, right, keep track of which AI you're using. Is it like Anthropic Claude 4.0? I think that's the most recent one, or the name, the version, the date you accessed it. What are some of the prompts? What are some of the outputs saved? Validating those outputs, right? By doing some of that manual spot checking and checking against the audio. Comparing with maybe the raw excerpts, documenting where you might disagree, right? So this is something that I come up with in teaching a lot because we can't sort of forbid the use of AI when people are trying to generate sort of themes or summaries out of a qualitative section of data, but we want to have folks think critically about like, okay, well, this is where I disagree with its output and why. And I think keeping track of that and having that transparency can go a long way towards sort of improving the quality of the outputs, right? Or the kind of generating the findings, right? So also including reflexive notes on how the tool shaped maybe what you paid attention to or how you coded, what your interpretation was, some of the decision making around that. And I think when it comes to publishing, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the journals require some of these qualitative checklists, um, to kind of ensure that your approach to developing the research design and the analysis is rigorous. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's, now more around kind of disclosure of AI. So disclosing, whether it was used, how it was used, how your outputs were verified. And this, I don't know how long this will last, but it's like AI tools should not be listed as authors. But then I know there's actually been some debate around that, like, but I don't know. I'm going to stick to that for now. And anyone can feel free to sort of disagree. But and then manuscripts should sort of also report AI use clearly enough for readers and reviewers to judge trustworthiness, rigor, and limits. So, for example, uh, I have a colleague who recently published a draft for submission. And, at the very top, the first thing that you see as you're reading through this draft is this sort of, oh, we use this particular tool to produce preliminary summaries of de-identified transcript. And we also used it as a tool to sort of support the organization and writing of the manuscript. All outputs were reviewed by the authors against source transcripts and were not treated as data or findings. And I think most centrally here, identifying that the analytic interpretation, the sort of like overarching approach taken, the intellectual contributions originated with the authors. So there's really clear transparency about how it was used and how some reflexivity as well around the author's use of it. So it's not being used uncritically, right? And you don't want to be one of these, you don't want to end up cited in in the Journal of Academic Librarianship, right? So like I think this idea of like phantom citations showing up is actually more common than we realize. And I was actually really surprised to go to a talk. It was Countway Library gave a talk, and one of the librarians there was talking about a paper that had been published in the journal Nature, and a whole section of like 10 citations just didn't exist. And there was like a whole section of the findings section that was clearly just generated by AI. And these citations sounded very plausible, this truthy nonsense again, very sort of like scientific sounding and right, the right terminology, but they just didn't exist. And I think that's becoming really kind of that is a big problem. And so I think there are a lot of people that think it can just go unchecked, but I think let no one don't be that person. So I think with regards to sort of grant acceptability, what reviewers need to see. So again, sort of framing AI to the same degree that we were just talking about the transparency in published work, treat it as a bounded efficiency tool, not a replacement for your own expertise. And perhaps also, again, specifying which steps in the process used AI. Maybe you used it to help in the literature review or some sort of aspect of the analysis. And what you as a researcher, as a team, do to kind of mitigate any outputs that are poor or biased, how you're going to kind of address that through the transparency of maybe comparing with the going back to the original data and the audio and that kind of thing. You might also address how you're navigating data security, participant protections, the kind of methodological fit. So some of these more overarching conceptual considerations rather than just a focus on sort of like, oh, it's going to speed up this process and save you money in terms of how much we're, you the grantor. Um, so just to kind of start to wrap up, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions and maybe some discussion if anyone wants to share their experiences. But I think ultimately it's this like promises and pitfalls a little bit, right? So again, just it can help with like transcription, cleanup, translation checks, searching large data sets, summarization. But again, qualitative research is so dependent on context, right? Reflexivity, interpretation, this sort of evidentiary traceability, all areas where, if used uncritically, AI can kind of weaken that sense of rigor, right? Which is already a big question mark. I feel like qualitative researchers are already primed to kind of really kind of articulate the process and the transparency, because we know that is the marker of quality. We don't have like a qualitative equivalent of like a power calculation or something like that. So these markers of quality really do kind of carry over into AI use as well. And I think, with regards to publishing and grants, I think when it's again presented as like an auditable support tool, which means that you as the researcher do need to keep that audit trail, not as a substitute for human analytic judgment. So again, it's the bottom line is it is just sort of a practical decision tool, right? If it's going to improve efficiency without weakening the context or the reflexivity, if you can't explain something or disclose something or validate something and defend its fit with your qualitative approach, then maybe don't use AI for that step. Um, and I think we've already made this point around, AI being limited to sort of more transparent, auditable support functions. But I really like this quote as just sort of a closing quote from Rudolph and colleagues that generative AI really is, at least for now, a language model, not a knowledge model, right? So it offers a different way to engage with qualitative data, but I think it really is central as researchers for us to kind of consider the stage and purpose of AI use in the process. And early on, kind of think of it as more of an explorative tool, as a sense checker, and then maybe later to verify, but to kind of keep in mind that we are the ones to kind of generate the knowledge, not the tool. It's just a tool, right? So it does not replace human expertise in qualitative research. So I'm going to leave it there. We have time for questions, and then also if there's time, if anyone wants to share if they've used AI in qualitative research already, or if you're thinking of using AI for your project, I figure we could just like maybe open it up. I don't know if there's like a specific protocol that makes more sense, but if anyone has any questions, I might stop sharing so we can all um, see one another.
Thank you, Jane, so much to think about, especially as it changes almost daily, I feel like. So yeah, maybe I'll just open it up to anyone on the call who has, either a specific question to Jane or the team, or anything that has you've kind of found through your engagement with AI in the qualitative space, or comparisons in the quantitative space, if that's a space that you're a little bit more engaged with. So just kind of open it up. Would love to hear what folks on the call are wondering about or what they've engaged with so far.
I just wanted to make a comment that I hadn't really thought about the fact, the confidentiality fact,
Mhm.
and also the IRB disclosure piece. And there are a lot of rules about like not using it for clinical decision making, et cetera. So I think people are doing a lot of thinking around that, but you're right in the assumption that, well, these are de-identified transcripts. So what does it matter? But the detail of the information does make them very identifiable. People will say, like, oh, my son was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and we had to come from Roxbury, and we
Mhm.
had to, and my husband works in this industry, and those are a lot of details that you could start putting the puzzle together and say, okay, now where are you? And in the quant space, you start to reduce cells. So it's like, well, if you have less than so many things in a cell, we don't identify that. But I just think that's really interesting from a data governance standpoint, and also the IRB piece.
Yeah, and I don't know what that would look like because I think, on the one hand, it's like, yes, you can kind of choose your level of de-identification and ideally, de-identify some of those bits, but that's not a guarantee. And then, you just never know what is happening to that transcript because then presumably anything that's fed in is training, you know, is used for training purposes for the next iteration of AI. So, I bring it up as a consideration, but with the caveat that I don't like, and with regards to sort of like also like participant consent around that, what that looks like in practice, right? because I can imagine, somebody asking me, and maybe again, as it becomes more ubiquitous, but maybe that's where kind of using tools like our sandbox or others that are kind of like oriented towards like, here's the information you can include, here's what you can't include, and here are the sort of clinical safety guardrails we have in place around that. Maybe that, will go a long way towards quelling some uncertainty around that. But yeah, it does feel like a big black box. And that's what's a little bit like we're all kind of navigating through this as it's happening. So I think it's really interesting. So I'm just sort of curious. Yeah, if anybody has direct experience with that or thoughts about that, by all means.
Well,
I'm,
ethically too. Like okay, if you consented for the research, but you didn't consent to have your transcript be used to train an AI model.
yeah.
So I don't know. It's just that you're right. That's wow, that gets messy.
So sorry, I don't have any answers. I'm just putting the questions out
No,
there.
I don't think there are.
Yeah.
I had a quick question. Thanks, Jane, for such a great presentation, and nice to see you. Um, I had a question related to publication and regardless of kind of disclosures and specification of how you used AI, if you or anyone on the call knows about any like stigma or hesitancy related to publishing something where AI was used, kind of regardless of that disclaimer, and if there's less likelihood of being published because of it.
I don't know of any stigma, and again, anyone else on the call, but I think because I am seeing either with colleagues or a few papers that I've reviewed lately that it is becoming more common to identify um, how it was used. I don't know that there would necessarily be a stigma. I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know, because otherwise, then I guess there would be the assumption it's like, well, is anyone actually going to say like, I had this tool do the analysis for me, which that would be sort of problematic. But I think for a lot of the ways that I've seen it articulated, I actually really appreciate it is the new reality, right? And it is there. So I appreciate knowing that like, okay, they used it to help, formulate the structure of the findings, or they used it to kind of pull out these initial summaries and then they went back in and in the methods section it talks about how they did this sort of comparative analysis between the output of the AI and the themes and what they generated as humans, right? So I think as long as there's that transparency there, but that's just my opinion, so I don't know if anybody has a different experience or sense of what they would feel as a reviewer, like if they saw that kind of disclosure.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work right now is thought pieces and kind of theoretical perspectives on it. So I think a lot of the initial launch in qualitative space was thinking about like what does this mean? How do we approach it? What are these kind of best next steps? As
Mhm.
well as some kind of like exploratory, like I used it for this and kind of more methodologically focused. I haven't seen, I mean, I think to Jane's point, it's going to become more ubiquitous. And I think right now it's a little ad hoc in terms of how journals themselves or grantors themselves are determining what their threshold for acceptability is. It will be interesting, I think, in the coming years to know kind of will it become kind of a base foundational threshold in terms of like what's acceptable, what's not in the qualitative space. I think it's really controversial right now, especially in qualitative work with all the points Jane brought up in terms of researcher closeness to your data, reflexivity, understanding contextual importance of the dynamics that you're studying. And so, sorry, I don't think there's a one set of rules that applies. I think it's a little bit all over the map and really dependent on the journal itself around publication. Some of them have very specified rules about what's allowed, what's not. Some of them it's a little bit more vague and generalized, kind of interpretable. So I think that will come to be more of a reality, but right now I think it's a little bit ad hoc, depending on the nature of where you're trying to get published or what grant you're applying for.
Makes sense. Thank you both.
Oh, Annie, I'm just seeing your point, going back to what we were just talking about with Carol, that some qualitative softwares have AI tools built in that raise questions about participant consent. Interesting.
Yeah,
Like
I was
what?
just gonna say Max QDA has some type of AI tool. And so I think it's almost like the horse is out of the barn in
Yeah.
the sense that like we have consented people to many projects already that for years that their data may be informing these tools.
And now it's built in. Yeah.
Other questions or comments or just ideas you want to toss out while we have a quorum to discuss?
I'm curious if people have experience with, I've used AI to kind of support my thinking, or, this is what I'm thinking. What do you, based on this, and kind of that validation piece. Um, and then going on to write, abstracts or things like that, and then just playing around and curious, using AI detector and being told this is AI, high percentage of AI. And you're like, well, no, it's not. I thought it first, it validated it. But then this concern of AI detection software with scholarly writing. So I don't know if anyone has any comment or experience, frustration with that.
I actually had a colleague who it was in an academic setting. He had students who were turning their papers in. He was using an AI detector, and almost everyone. The report came back that almost everybody had used it. And what he figured out is what it was actually detecting is the editing, the like Grammarly in Microsoft Word. So it in fact was not at all AI generated. It was just the spell check. Um, so I think there's also some problems currently with the AI detection software as well.
Yeah, then you just find yourself undermining the quality of your own writing by trying to uh, outsmart the AI. So,
And it's
thanks.
being forced. I feel like there's always like, do you want, can I help you? Like it always pings up, even when I was like putting together this presentation, it's like, can I help you make this better? It's just kind of yeah, kind of forced on us. And then yeah, that software detector is, I could see being kind of an issue for sure.
Yeah, Jen, I have a similar pain point. My writing is often flagged as AI generated, even without the use of Grammarly. I think it's a bit tough with the academic writing style. Um, I have a question about using AI or partnering with AI in tool development. I think a lot of the conversation today is around using or partnering with AI
Mhm.
for analytic tasks, right? Um, but I'm wondering, Jane, if you and others in the room have thoughts on using AI to develop our tools. Like I've seen some trainings announced regarding using AI for cognitive testing of surveys. So just curious about what you all are thinking about in regards to that.
Yeah, I don't know, Brett or Gwen, cognitive interviews, surveys, how, I'm not sure. And I know, Gwen, you're going to be giving a talk in a few weeks, so I don't know if you're going to touch on this then, but oh,
I
you're
don't have
muted.
any. I haven't
A
actually
little.
tried using it, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I sort of as a thought experiment, like put in a survey or like a survey prompt to AI to see like what it came up with for a project I was working on, and there was a lot of overlap with like the content in terms of the survey. So I think it was really good at like coming up with like response options or like topic areas to cover. But I think, where I found some issues is just sort of like in the conventions of survey writing, and some of that was like lacking a little bit. And so, I do think it needs to be like a collaborative process. You can't just like solely rely on it to produce something perfect, and it does need, some of your guidance and expertise, at least I like to think for now. But that's been my experience, but it has been helpful, in some regards. I don't know what you think, Brett, if you have anything.
It never occurred to me to use it to write the cognitive engineering questions. It would be interesting to take a project that we've already done and then enter that in and use that as a comparison um, to see what its capabilities are.
Yeah, and apparently researchers are experimenting with using um, agentic profiles or personas in order to participate. So, as participants in cognitive testing, I don't know much about this. So, there's a training or talk being given at the upcoming what is it, International Conference for Computational Social Sciences on the topic. So I'll be happy to share what I learned. I'm very curious about just in general how others on the qual or quant side are using or testing the use of AI models and AI agents. Um, Sounds fascinating, but I could imagine that the considerations on regarding the risks are abundant.
Yeah, I'm curious, like Jane or Anna, if either of you have used it in like developing like an interview guide or something.
I did it wasn't in the development, it was more kind of in a curiosity check, I think, Jen and Mariah, what you're kind of mentioning. So I, wrote up a interview guide based on, a meeting I had had with the research team just to kind of see like, what would it come up with if I kind of gave it the prompts that I gave myself in the guide development. Um, and I would say it was kind of an interesting check. It didn't do I didn't think it did a great job in terms of like catching some of the subtle nuances that the research team was interested in terms of like knowing their priorities in terms of
Mhm.
aims and how deep to go in terms of any given set of questions. So on a guide, you'll have some questions that are pretty broad and you touch on lightly, and other sections that are really critical to dive in deep and really understand in more depth and add some additional probes to. So it was kind of like a interesting content check. Like, was there any topic that I hadn't, framed in a particular way? But I didn't find its style of questioning and probe development all that helpful. It was more like a topic check of content check. Did I hit all the main things that it would have thought of? But I haven't used it as to produce anything without my initial kind of doing of it.
Yeah, same, just as like a check, a sort of overall topic guide or like a place
Yeah.
to get started and make sure I'm not missing anything. But usually I'll try and I haven't done that often, but times I have done it, it's like I'll give it a go first. And then I'm like, is there anything else I should be thinking
Yeah.
about? But to Anna's point, it doesn't really capture the nuance or the more direct probes that may be more aligned with the aims of the particular project. So
And knowing the study population as well. So thinking
yeah.
about, even if I've prompted it I included it in the prompt in terms of like who we'll be speaking to and kind of the inclusion criteria for this study. And um, knowing some of those populations that I've worked with before and how to frame questions and how to really get at some of that nuance, it failed to do that in a way that I thought was really meaningful.
I
All right.
think the same,
Oh, go
I
ahead.
think this same, has, there's the same danger in the survey research too, because it's going to know about all kinds of scales that are out there. The
Mm.
skill is making sure that the context is right and that, yes, this scale fits this particular context, and that I think that's where you need a trained person.
All right, so now we're coming up on time. Any last minute additions or questions people want to throw out there before we finish up?
I have one quick question, and it
Yeah,
kind
definitely.
of builds on what Sarah Pohl was mentioning earlier, but just kind of curious if you have any insight or comment on how quickly we might see these topics kind of filter into best practices and like criteria, like the CORIC.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when we think about like quant and AI, you often hear about like validating models and things like that. If that might be a best practice that we move towards qualitatively.
Yeah, I don't know, but that's what I was wondering as well, is like at what point, and I would imagine soon, you might start seeing specific references to how it was used in some of the like the checklist, the quality checklist, like the CORIC. But yeah, I don't know, Anna or Brett or anybody else, if you have any kind of
I haven't seen any updates in any of
uh-huh.
the checklists that I'm familiar with, but when you're thinking about, so kind of the current approach is kind of ad hoc determination depending on your group or your journal. And so I feel like in order for that to become part of those courts or more, broadly established checklists, there has to be an agreement kind of throughout the qualitative research community writ large. And so I don't think we're there. I wouldn't be surprised if it's coming our way in the coming years, where there will be a team who's kind of dedicated to determine what that would look like in a checklist. But as I've currently seen them, none of the checklists I know have been officially updated to kind of been broadly accepted, that where journal reviewers are looking for those updated checklists, things like that.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if it's coming our way.
hopefully it is. I think it'll be helpful. It feels a
As
little bit,
guidance.
yeah, intimidating at the moment. So yeah, thank you.